This is from a work by a man called Papias of Hierapolis. He was Bishop of Hierapolis, which is in modern Turkey, right at the beginning of the 2nd century. That's when he was writing this book, and we have just a few fragments of his work, including this bit of his prologue to his work. And the key thing about it is not when he was writing it, which was at the beginning of the 2nd century, but the period he's talking about, which was back in probably about the 80s of the 1st century, when he himself was collecting gospel traditions. And it's around the time when the Gospels of Luke and Matthew probably were being written. So he's really a rather interesting witness of what was going on in terms of the availability of gospel traditions at that period. And he talks about how he carefully collected traditions. He seems to have stayed put in Hierapolis, but was on a major route. So any Christians who came through, he quizzed them about what they could tell him. And he talks about, in the bit I'll read you, he talks about the elders, by which he means the people who had been disciples of Jesus, not themselves disciples of Jesus, but as it were the next step in a chain of tradition. And he says, if by chance someone who had been a follower of the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders. That is, what Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any other of the Lord's disciples said, and whatever Aristion and John the Elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying. For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and abiding voice. So he's asking them, first of all, for traditions about what these famous disciples of Jesus, Andrew and Peter and so on, had been saying, and I think it implies that they were no longer saying it, so they were dead at that point. So those major figures were already dead, but he's collecting the traditions that they passed on about the words of Jesus, the stories about Jesus. And then he says, whatever Aristion and John the Elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying. So there he's making a distinction between those disciples of Jesus who were no longer around, they died, and two disciples of Jesus who were still around and were obviously lesser known disciples of Jesus. They're not members of the 12 apostles, they're others. But they're disciples of Jesus who were still living when Papias was collecting his traditions. Probably they were teaching elsewhere in Asia Minor, in modern Turkey. And Papias is getting their traditions at just second hand. He's hearing them from people who had heard them. If he'd prepared to travel, he would have been able to hear them himself, but he obviously didn't. He just stayed put and collected whatever people said. And then he said, I did not think information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and abiding voice. And really what he's being there is a good historian in the ancient sense of the word historian. In other words, oral information from eyewitnesses was what ancient historians were really interested in. It's why they thought you could only really write contemporary history. You could only write history from within living memory while there were still eyewitnesses around. And the best thing was to be an eyewitness yourself. Second best was to meet the eyewitnesses and interview them. That's why it's better than books. You can't ask questions of books. If you meet the people, you can ask them questions. You can get a sense of whether they're reliable or not. So they value this kind of oral interchange with eyewitnesses. And Papias hasn't quite got that. He's got next best thing, just one stage from that. But notice what is evidently the case, that at that stage, the traditions about Jesus were attached to people's names. This was a tradition that Andrew told, or this was a tradition that James or John, or Aristion or the elder John. Traditions were not just anonymous, they were passed down in the names of the eyewitnesses who had first told the stories and went on telling the stories. It's what we would now call oral history, I think. It's what people do nowadays about contemporary history, people who go around collecting interviews with people who experience the events. It's a special sort of history, and it's what the historians in the ancient world thought history was really about. And of course they had far fewer documentary stories, documentary sources, than historians have nowadays. So it made a lot of sense for ancient historians to rely very much on the oral witness of eyewitnesses.